everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm Syra Levinson. I'm the Deputy Director, and Gail Engelberg, Director of Education and Public Engagement at the Guggenheim Museum. This afternoon, we're so glad to have you. We are joined by ASL interpreter Nicole. She is here with me on the screen and will remain with us through the program this afternoon. Our panelists will also be providing verbal descriptions as we introduce ourselves. So I am a white woman in my 40s. I am wearing a white shirt with long sleeves. I have long hoop earrings made of brass, and I'm sitting in a room with a ceiling fan above me and a kind of grayish light all around. This afternoon, it's my true and honest pleasure to welcome you to the first ever virtual session of Summer of No, a series that's been going for a couple of years, 4 or 5 years at the Guggenheim, to focus on the intersection of art and ideas and critical issues. This year, we are joined and are co-curating the series with Four Freedoms. And you will be hearing today from the founders of Four Freedoms, Hank Willis Thomas, Michelle Wu, and Eric Gottesman. The themes that we'll explore today are focused on healing, justice, the power of listening, and the conversation will be moderated by Claudia Pena, who is Executive Director of Four Freedoms. For those of you who are not familiar with this amazing institution, organization, collective, Four Freedoms is a platform that is designed and created to foster civic engagement, discourse, and direct action with artists and other creative thinkers. The four freedoms are freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom of worship, and freedom of speech. And since its founding, Four Freedoms has been engaged in producing exhibitions, installations, public programs that have used art, public discourse around the nation, and a participation in the civic space. Today, we at the Guggenheim are immensely grateful to Four Freedoms for their partnership and for leading today's discussion. The conversation is incredibly timely for us as an institution, as these themes are resonating deeply, and we want to be clear that we welcome and are happy to have an open dialogue through today's exchange and in the question and answer section. I also want to extend my gratitude to the family of Elaine Turner Cooper for their generous support of programming at the Guggenheim and for making this series possible. And with that, and without further ado, I will turn it over to Claudia. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining.
Hello. This virtual world still has got us trying to figure things out. I didn't know if I was supposed to turn on my video or if someone was going to do it for me. Welcome, everyone. So excited to be here with some of my favorite people, Michelle and Hank and Eric, who I'll be introducing shortly. But given that I'm sitting in Los Angeles in my chair, and how exciting to be doing this from my very own home, I just wanted to acknowledge the Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tumbagar, which runs from the Los Angeles Basin all the way down to the Southern Channel Islands. Always important to recognize the people who have been here since the beginning. And for us, it's the Tongva people. I want to quickly introduce our panelists, but before I do that, I just want to do some housekeeping. We'll be taking a few questions throughout the program. So please feel free to use the chat box to submit questions and any comments as we move along. It's more difficult in this virtual space to make these things a dialogue. The way that we usually like to come at things from Four Freedoms is we see everything as a collaboration. So please make that effort to engage so that we can make this as much of a dialogue as possible, even though we can't see your beautiful faces. So let me start by introducing these folks. All of them are co-founders of Four Freedoms, and each of the three of them are artists. So they are, creative imaginators all the time, every day. But they also play specific roles at Four Freedoms, and so I want to touch on that. Oh, I also forgot to describe myself. So I am brown skin. I have long dark hair. I'm sitting in front of a beautiful bookcase with all my books. If you zoom in, which I don't think that you can, you'd see there's a whole shelf dedicated to Octavia Butler. I'm also wearing a colorful shirt, blue and orange. Okay, let us start off with Michelle Wu. She is the chief curator at Four Freedoms, also again a co-founder and artist. And we also see her as sort of the heart and healer of the organization. Michelle?
Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here today. I'm Michelle Wu. I'm also greeting you today from Los Angeles, the land of the Tongva and Chumash peoples. I am a Chinese American woman with freckles, a black hoodie, and black headphones, big black headphones.
And next we have Hank Willis Thomas, who's a co-founder of Four Freedoms and very obviously an artist. He's also at Four Freedoms referred to as our disruptor at large. So he disrupts things, disorients things in order to get folks in the space that they need to be in order to be able to collaborate and roll with us. He's also the creative genius core of our organization. Hank?
None of that is true. I am a rainbow surrounded by clouds.
For accessibility purposes, Hank, can you also describe what you look like?
I just did. I believe that race and gender are fictions, and what we look like has nothing to do with who we are.
He's also wearing a black t-shirt. He's got white headphones hanging down, and there's a lot of sun right behind him. All right. The next person is Eric, also a co-founder and artist. He's our chief story officer. He also keeps our work very global in context, and he is the Justice Center of Four Freedoms.
Thank you, Claudia. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. I am in New Hampshire. I'm coming to you from New Hampshire, land of the Abenaki people, which I'm putting in the chat. I am a half Eastern European, half Lebanese man with brown hair and what has become my fancy pink shirt in these times, in a white room with a bit of a painting in the background.
Thank you. All right, before we get into it, I want to give Michelle, let's go with Michelle. Will you just describe what are the new Four Freedoms at Four Freedoms, the new Four Freedoms at Four Freedoms?
Sure. Thank you, Claudia. So for those of you who are a little less familiar with our work, Four Freedoms believes in the vital role of culture in transforming our social and political systems. Our 2020 campaign will focus on not only increasing voter engagement, but a longer-term vision of a great awakening centered around healing, justice, and listening, which are also the themes of today's discussion. Inspired by a little-known group of young abolitionist dreamers called the Wide Awakes, we hope to build upon our previous work of modeling creative civic action through centering artists and visionaries in public discourse. Being wide awake in 2020, we practice and value compassion, critical thinking, imagination, and accountability. We accept that we cannot go backwards. We change, or we understand that change starts with us, and that we are also innately connected to one another. In order to grow our resilience and understanding of the world and one another, it's important to look deeply at ourselves and practice mindful presence in our speech, actions, and thoughts. We believe that creativity can help us to find our voice, and that meditating on how we participate, whether it's in daily life, in political life, or in our studios making art, this meditation on the how can help us to harness that power for abundant and substantive transformation. And with the arrival of COVID and its unmasking of the nation's systemic iniquities, we were inspired to reconsider the longer-term goals of the work. So I'm going to turn it over to my collaborator, Eric, now to begin a deeper dive into the pillars just described.
Cool. Wait, am I supposed to talk about listening now?
I think I was gonna let me pose the question of if listening were an object to anybody. Listening were an object, what would it be?
I have an answer.
Go.
Did you guys ever read Calvin and Hobbes? No, not that much. My kids found like these old books that we had as kids because I'm at my parents' house, and in Calvin and Hobbes, like one of the characters, Calvin, who's a little boy, like creates a cardboard box and then writes on it transmogrifier, and you're supposed to be able to go into that machine and then like get transmogrified into something else, whatever else you want it to be. So I feel like that's the thing that comes to mind is like listening is like transmogrifier.
Is that something we're supposed to know?
No, I don't know how is Calvin and Hobbes universal? I don't really know.
No, Michelle and I have never read them.
Nobody has.
I know of it though.
It sounds like listening is something that you can't understand.
It has to get transmogrified in order to be understood. Okay, so if healing was an animal, which animal would healing be?
I have an answer. I think that healing would be a butterfly. Butterflies have multiple stages of life. Some species have really long larval stages. And I think that's a metaphor for growth and sort of a final transformation into what it already was. It also can live, I think, anywhere between like a week and a year. So I think it also speaks to the kind of fleeting nature of our experience, that even when we feel in moments of healing, we recognize that the moments won't last and that the work of healing and compassion needs to continue.
Love it. Let's see. What if justice was a food?
A what?
If justice were a food.
Oh, you like food.
I like food. Yes.
I like French fries. So
I have an answer to if justice were a food. If justice were a food, is the seasoning a food? I think it should be salt, because you need at least a little bit in everything in order for it to come out well. All right, then Hank, you're gonna have to answer this one. If awakening were a season, what would it be?
it would be summer 2020.
All right, can't wait to hear more about that. Here we go, y'all.
Thank you for the compliment about the salt, though. And if we were caterpillars, maybe we are in the cocoon stage.
All right, then we can't be one of those butterflies with long larval stages. If summer of 2020 is a great awakening. All right, we have, let's see, we've got 45 minutes left. We want to hold 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions. So we got about a half hour to do our thing here. So let's get moving. Let's see, let's start off with listening if we're going to order these. And the first question would be, how does listening build greater understanding and resilience? And I think this is going to Eric. Eric, if you can help frame listening for us a bit and thinking about building greater understanding and resilience.
Yeah. I mean, I I'm struck. I just met Nicole. And thank you, Nicole, for being here. And just some of the questions that you were asking made me think about the difference between listening and hearing, and how, I don't know, I cite on the body listening like with ears, right? Like you listen to, some of us listen to music, right? Or but it's also an ability to hear. So like but I feel like, I don't know, in my work in the past, I've thought about listening. I started out in photography. Actually, before photography, I started out in thinking about politics and law and justice. And I think that as I moved into working with photography, the idea of me being a person that could look at another person and make something, make an image, felt very one directional. And I think that I was really interested in figuring out a way to create feedback, a feedback loop, which is again another like audio kind of like word. And so I thought a lot about visual listening then, and like how listening can be sort of a way of creating feedback. And so, and creating feedback and transforming and opening the possibility of changing your conception of the world, your ideas, who you are. Like listening for me is a way to like create surprise or disruption and even awakening, let's say. Even though we think about awakening in terms of, well, at least we have been thinking about awakening in terms of the eyes. And so I think that form of listening that can transform yourself and create surprise, like a collective surprise, is something that that can lead to a more sustainable world, or to more, to stronger foundations of relationships and of ways we can think about power and how it can be dispersed. I don't know if I answered the question, but
It doesn't really matter as long as you're talking about listening. Michelle and Hank, do you want to jump in there?
I saw a question just came from Michelle. I don't know if that's not, I should probably not the one that's supposed to say that.
Yeah, we can get to that during the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay. I think it's all connected. And we're not being coy. I know there might be people who think or expect that we will be being declarative. I think this is about learning, and listening is about accepting. And the difference between listening and hearing, I think, are listening is actually the access point to hearing, and it has nothing to do with the auditory or visual learning. Because seeing is deceiving, as well as hearing as well as listening when you're not hearing.
Eric, there was one thing that you said that I would like to hear more about, this idea that listening can be disruption or disruptive, or should be used for disruption, or be say more.
Yeah, it's almost like a should be thing. I feel like I guess it's maybe a measure of how well you're listening, or how closely you're listening, or something like that. That it shouldn't just be that I hear what you're saying and I mean, we all experience this, even amongst the four of us. I think we hear things that we say and we either agree or disagree or something like that. But I think the more exciting thing is happens when listening, whether it's through auditory or visual or like some other sense, physical, even institutional, like that new ideas and new if listening is happening, then there are pathways for new things to enter the body or the institution or the community or whatever it is, and or the leadership, or and that can shift, that shifts something sort of elemental. Yeah, and that's different than a sort of like, you know, performative listening or performative hearing or something like that.
Yeah, I hear that. It's like if true listening was happening, that there would be something on the other side, a disruption, a response, an intervention of something. Something has to come out of listening. I get that.
Yeah.
Michelle, were you going to weigh in?
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think oftentimes when we listen, we're actually thinking about what we want to say and what we think. And so we're not actually present for that other person. So I think listening is really about being present. And I think part of being present is also about observing your own reactions in the body to what is being said or enacted or to be said or enacted. And I think by observing what feelings may come up for you, enables you to sort of hear it with more openness and vulnerability.
Connected to that, Michelle, you're talking about vulnerability and openness, which is, I think, related to healing. I wanted to know if you can maybe frame healing for us a little bit. And one prompt that you can answer or ignore is, you know, how do we heal from pain that maybe isn't directly ours?
Yeah, I'd be happy to try and answer that. I think as soon as we create distance between my pain, your pain, their pain, I think we fail to recognize this inherent connection to each other. And I'm a huge fan of the Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, and he said something that really resonated with me, and that was, you know, happiness is not an individual matter. We're a continuation of our parents and our ancestors before that. Our body is not ours alone. It is also the body of our ancestors. And that the suffering of each of us affects others through a kind of ripple effect. So when we experience healing through the practice of giving and receiving compassion and true listening, as we discussed with Eric, especially with those we feel intense anger, frustration, or disagreement with, we not only nourish happiness in ourselves, but as a group as well. So combining our experiences and insights leads to a collective insight that can be wiser than the sum of its parts, as he says. So of course, before we look more deeply at this truer nature, we must work towards addressing the crisis at hand, which is, you know, of course, the current state of our world, our society, and our politics. But I think having these more intrinsic ideas in the back of our minds as we sort of move and act and speak, the hope is that it will engender a different model for interacting that can hopefully lead to change and healing.
Yeah. Hank or Eric, any responses to that?
I heard two things. I try to keep my fingers crossed to remember them. I heard that disruption is a part of hearing, and I heard that we are all every piece of suffering, every suffering that any of us has a ripple effect from body to body, and therefore there are many things that we as human beings probably are rippling or sending out waves like antennas, whether it be that past and even ancestral pain, and that healing probably has the same ripple effect opportunity if you are tuned into the same wavelength. Is that fair to say? I often don't fully follow when you get there like that, Michelle. So I'm glad I was listening.
Yeah, thank you, Hank. I think we often think about healing in terms of ourselves or our group or our family. And we don't think about it as we're a part of this much larger whole, and that true healing can't be achieved until we actually start to understand that we are all connected, that it's not just about me, it's not just about my family or my group, but that it's about everyone.
Yeah, and Hank, I would say you probably understand that quite a bit, given that I've seen artworks of yours that say that they are us and us is them. I've even seen them on billboards, which we'll probably put up later this year. And I know we'll get to the questions about what we're doing this year, but yeah, I mean, I bet that underlies a lot of what you think about in your work.
I think that was our work, so.
One quick question that came in via the chat is, would you say that listening, in order to do good listening, you have to withhold judgment? As in, if you're judging, you're not listening?
I would. The question is, when are you not judging?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily not having judgment, because I think we're all humans with egocentric brains and we always think about everything in relationship to ourselves. So I think it's more about recognizing the judgments as they appear and not getting attached to them, because our judgments often change. So being able to recognize as they come up allows us to more easily, I think, let them go.
Yeah, and I want to ask you a question, Claudia, but I have one thing on this. Like, one thing that I've been doing with the kids, like when they get really upset, is it's like a version of John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence, where, like the whole idea was that it was a performance of silence that proved, in fact, that no silence exists. And so when the kids do it, we do 20 seconds of silence, and it just allows them to connect with their bodies and to like be in their bodies. And there's, but it is a moment to take stock, but it's also a moment to realize that like no judgment doesn't exist really. But speaking of judgment and justice, although that's probably not a fair equivalence, I wonder what you think, Claudia, of the relationship between creativity and justice. And like, do you see justice as a creative action, or how do you see that? And I can't remember if you said that you're a lawyer.
I did not say.
Among many things.
I did not say. And I love this question because I think justice is impossible without creativity. When I think of justice, I think of bringing balance or healing or resolution, and none of those things are possible unless you can actually imagine them. And as we all know, imagination takes creativity. And it's the lack of creativity that has brought us what people traditionally think of justice as punishment or retribution, or anything that brings more harm and pain to people in our society. And, often when people think of the word justice, they think of the criminal justice system. And with respect to that, we have the Center for New Leadership. I hope folks know who they are. They're staffed by community and youth experts who are directly impacted by criminalization, mass incarceration, et cetera. So it's this really great organization, and they've created a lot of analysis and language around these things. And one of the things they've come up with that I really love is this idea of human justice. And it's an equation. It's human rights plus human development equals human justice. And it's this idea that when people cause harm in society, it's usually a result of lack of access to something, a result of systems of oppression, a result of transphobia, racism, lack of access to jobs, the harms of hypercapitalism, et cetera, et cetera. So when I think of justice with regard to that, it's really easy for me to imagine all kinds of ways in which it should look different, including restorative and transformative justice and access to resources in order to stop the trauma to prison pipeline. But the other side of that is when people with power or institutions with power cause harm, then that whole equation looks different, right? Then it's like less about access to human development and really their own complicity in the way systems of oppression currently work. And for people who are prison abolitionists, the first set of circumstances I spoke about are really they're easy to get into. When it comes to people in power or institutions with power causing harm, causing pain, either internally or externally or all the way around, it's much harder, I think, to conceptualize what justice would look like in those moments. So it requires a lot of creativity, right, when those harms occur. And I think that we are in a space right now with regard to social media and just where we are in 2020, where there's a lot of accountability happening in lots of different places and spaces and in lots of different ways. And I think it's amazing how people feel very empowered to speak truth to power and to take matters into their own hands in order to access justice in the way that they envision it. And I'm hoping that together we can come up with even better ways so that when harm occurs, no matter who's causing the harm, that everybody comes out better in the end, not just the person who suffered the harm, but the harm causer as well, that we can imagine spaces and resolutions that include everybody evolving, everybody getting better, and everybody benefiting in some way. My thoughts on that.
Related probably to the Octavia Butler that's on your shelves.
Indeed. Who else would teach us how to envision a world that's worth living in for everybody but Black women? Black women are always leading every social movement. They're always leading us as the thought leaders. They're the ones who have carried a lot of the social justice work on their back for centuries, essentially. So yes, that is where I take my guidance in many forms. Y'all want to weigh in on the creativity of justice? Or
not after you just said all that, which were like, okay. I'm like, where was my pen and paper? If people don't understand, may not know that we chose to really be surprised by each other and listen, so we could listen more carefully in this case. And these are the kind of conversations that we don't often have time to have with one another. So it's wonderful to be learning from you all as well as I know you.
Then Hank, I want to turn to you. Oh, Eric,
okay.
Oh no,
I have a thought too.
I was just going to say it was interesting that transformation is part of all three of the things that we've talked about so far.
Agreed.
Claudia, I just wanted to make one quick comment before we move on to the next piece in response to you. I think when you said that we have to be able to imagine what justice looks like in order for it to happen, and that's why creativity is intrinsic to it, I was thinking about the fact or the relationship between the harm doer and the harmed, and that relationship is also requires creativity because it requires creativity and collaboration. And collaboration, I think, is also inherently creative because it does actually require, it requires the the flexibility, the compassion, and listening on both parts. That harm and healing cannot be enacted by one. It has to be something that both parties essentially agree to.
Or a collaboration of some sort, right? Because we also can imagine that sometimes people can heal from harm that was caused, even if the harm doer is not present, but if there's some envisioning of what that looks like, what that relationship looks like, whether it's by proxy or just by process or whatever it is, right? There's sometimes it's direct engagement and sometimes it's indirect engagement, but no matter what, I think you're exactly right. It always is going to be collaboration, which is community, right? We can't do healing. We can't do any of this stuff without community.
So Claudia, in your classes, because I feel like I'm now in your classroom at UCLA,
Sorry.
where you teach transformative and restorative justice, can you tell us what they are and what the difference is?
Oh man, you want me to do that in the 1 minute that we have before we need to move on to our next topic, or else we won't get through our whole panel?
Sounds important.
It is important, and I could talk about an entire course on it, which means
just give us the short lines, please. Sorry to interrupt.
All right. I don't think it's as helpful right now to distinguish between restorative and transformative justice, but what I will say is that transformative justice is this idea that when harm is caused and people need to heal, what that end result might look like will require transformation of all the different environments or issues that were at play in the first place. So very likely it is addressing systems of oppression that exist in order to be able to bring the parties involved to any sort of healing. And it also requires process, engagement, dialogue, community, etc. But the point is that when you have transformative justice, that people are evolving, that us together we're evolving and getting ourselves to a better place, as opposed to some sort of, I'll use this as one example, and I'm not saying that I disagree or agree with it, but when we quote unquote hold somebody accountable and then that person is no longer allowed to either exist or play or have the position they had before or just be part of the community when it's exile or something like that, right? It's not really transformative justice, because what we've done is we've just created a space where some people can no longer exist, can no longer be part of the community, be part of the relationship. I'm going to move forward, if that's all right with you, Hank, because I want to ask you, what does awakening mean to you?
Well, once again, I don't know. I'm just experiencing it. Sounds like everything that you all have talked about apply to this. And I feel like we're not the only people in the world. Everyone around the world is going through a process of transformation that requires listening, healing, and I will now say transformative justice, apparently, including certain people that a lot of people do not like right now in DC. It's really provocative to recognize that our president is also part of our community, and that is part of our challenge. We are all one, in my belief, and the deception when we talk about how people look and where they come from, both things that I'm always very interested in, allows us to create the us and them kind of characteristic, and therefore doesn't leave room for any gray area. And when I say I'm a rainbow, it's because people think I'm Black because I am African American, which are different. They don't see the rest of me. And I think all of us have to perform on a regular basis, even with people we love and know very well, as a way to feel appreciated and accepted. And I don't know anyone who doesn't have flaws and extreme trauma. And oftentimes when people act out of violence and hate, they're clearly in need of healing. I've been loved so well. And so I've taken the perspective, and I've been hurt, and I've learned, frankly, through the grace of my grandmother, who's 98 years old, that and barely talks, that again, Black women are freaking amazing. And I knew that, and my cousin Songa Willis, who was murdered at gunpoint, he would always talk about how her grandmother was so deep. And it wasn't until Christmas of this year, when I was 43 years old, that I was like, holy smokes, the Bible is not just about being good and nice. Because she just started giving me these books that I've never read, and I started reading of it. She would read this verse, and I was like, what? You don't talk. How do you know? And I realized that the listening, as Michelle is talking about, that my grandmother always does, is an incredible tool. And choosing your words or gestures very carefully actually is critical. And so sometimes you might have to wait 43 years to get your point across. So I'm really loving. I think awakening is going through disruption, and rather than responding before you actually have listened deeply, to accept, as Michelle spoke about, and then come to terms that justice cannot be resolved without creativity. And so I believe this is the year of a great awakening, like what happened in 1965, what happened in 68, what happened in 1920 when the universal suffrage, and what happened especially in 1860 when the Republican Party was only 6 years old, and like 5 shopkeepers and include some, like a tailor, a handyman, saw a rich white Southerner by the name of Cassius Marcellus Clay, who from Kentucky, who recognized and said vehemently that slavery is an abomination to our society, and felt the need that everyone should know, and started Berea College, one of the first free colleges for Black people, where Carter G. Woodson went and Bell Hooks teach today. Carter G. Woodson started Black History Week, which is now Black History Month. And I believe Black history is all everywhere and all the time. And so I believe being awakened, and I just woke up 8 months ago. Being awake isn't a thing to be arrogant, it's a thing to be humble about, and recognize that all of our lives are meaningless, yet all lives are our lives. And the root of that, so we talk about Blackness, as I said, it's many things, and it may not look, and the skin color has nothing to do with it. Sunil Gupta, a Black British artist, activist who is actually from India, and it said that Blackness is your relationship to power. And I think we often get caught up. I got caught up in, and we see in these divide and conquer native issue, indigenous issues, Latinx issues, Afro, Black, Negro issues, white issues. They don't acknowledge the totality of who we all are. And I have no idea where I am, literally. I'm lost somewhere, and that's why I'm not sitting in a place of comfort where I can even know where I am. And so I guess, and being awake for me is being totally okay with that, because as long as I have a breath, I'm okay. And also I've already breathed a lot into the world, and it's only my arrogance and love of comfort wants me to be alive in a moment when so many people are suffering. Does that make any sense?
Of course it does.
Okay.
You always make sense to me. I don't
To
know
somebody
else. Also, I just want to point out that you're the disruptor at large. So some people might receive what you said about 45, the resident of the White House, as disruptive, but also Miriam Kaba, who is one of the country's leaders and foremost trainers on transformative justice. She just said the same thing to us a few months ago at a transformative justice training, and everybody was like, "Don't, you can't say that." So you guys are, on the same train there, or same whatever.
I must have heard it somewhere, because that's what I think we're sending these ripple effects. And so I think the ripple effect of positivity is what we need right now. And also, if we need disruption, if we haven't hit rock bottom yet, what next?
Yeah.
Well, and
All right.
I think that's I think what you said at the beginning about leadership in Washington or whatever. But I mean, it's a moment where we're recognizing we Americans are, which is not something I've sort of ever really felt comfort in identifying as. But you know, we're experiencing what people around in other parts of the world are, you know, have been experiencing all the time. I mean, like, and I think that the kind of tribalism that has worked its way into our politics over time strategically is so solidified, is something that that points to, I mean, there are other rock bottoms, and yeah, I think it's really important for us to
I can see
prevent
this.
that or acknowledge
I can
that.
see this is getting really exciting. I see that look on your face, Hank. We also have 13 minutes left, which is the amount of time we had wanted to put aside for a Q&A.
Well-
And we still need to talk about our campaign.
Okay, one thing that's critical, because it is a matter of life and death for me. Because of the way I look, I am perceived as a threat. And my cousin and many, too far many indigenous people, African Americans and Latinx people were described physically. And for that reason, Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, as we know, and so many in this year alone were killed because there was a call that said there's a black boy or a black man coming somewhere, not rather than a person was walking down the street. And so as a person who looks like me, I don't care if I'm an artist, I'm a famous artist or whatever, I'm a person. And if you don't see that first, I'm in trouble. Sorry.
That was really important. I mean, the way, you know, race gets weaponized against vulnerable communities, especially Black people, Black trans folks, Black men, Black women. I mean, that's a really salient point, and I'm glad you made it. It's important. I want to, on that really deep and important note, I want to pivot to thinking about our campaign, the For Freedoms 2020 campaign, which is still, the title is still under construction. I don't know if Eric wants to weigh in on that, but Michelle, I also want to hear from you about what we're doing in the campaign specifically, because one of the questions that came in was these themes, these freedoms sound really exciting and we can get down with them, but what does it look like? What is the plan? What are we doing in order to promote listening, justice, healing, awakening?
Thanks, Claudia. And Eric, feel free to weigh in because you're really good at, you know, sort of downloading all of this into pragmatic terms, if you will. So our campaign is launching next week officially. It's actually comprised of a few different strategies. The first of which is digital media content around the theme of a Great Awakening. So something that is really central to our work is injecting these larger, deeper ideas from culture into the public discourse, into this political conversations, with the hope that it can help to sort of reshape the way we have these conversations, and who's allowed to be a part of the conversations to begin with. As mentioned earlier, I think something inherent to the work is that we really do believe that creativity is a pathway for finding our own voice and being able to harness that voice and turn it into power to enact, power to change, power to transform our own circumstances and thus the world around us. So I just kind of wanted to give you a little bit of, you know, sort of more conceptual context in case you didn't already have enough about sort of the purpose of injecting this kind of messaging and artwork out into the public realm. We're also developing partnerships with political advisors and voter advocacy groups to do a For Freedom style GOTV campaign. So it won't look like your typical GOTV campaign where it says vote or text this number and vote. A lot of great organizations do that work. It's effective. They've the infrastructure and the technology to do that. I think what we do well is something akin to what I just described. It's really about trying to include as many creative, diverse voices in the conversation as possible. So we'll be working with pre-existing content and developing new content with artists to start to create a culture in which voting is not an obligation, but it is the thing that we do because it is cool and because it matters. And the other main strategy to our campaign is also a reactivation of our state-by-state network. So for those who don't know about our 50-state initiative in 2018, we worked with institutions and artists in all 50 states, including DC and Puerto Rico, to do simultaneous decentralized art actions around the election. So we'll be reactivating that network of around 1,000 folks in all pockets of the country to do creative civic acts in the lead up to the election, but also beyond the election as well. And that'll be done by disseminating a creative brief, which we're developing. That includes, it's kind of a menu of options, of templates, of models that we've created for creative civic action. It also describes what that means and how to get involved and what resources will be available. Some of those resources could include funding, PR and marketing support. It could also include, just amplifying the work that you're already doing. We also serve as a hub, as a connector. So something, for example, if connecting artists with institutions, connecting artists with each other, connecting artists with social impact groups, or just connecting folks who are on a similar path and want to do great work and just need moral support, need camaraderie during this increasingly divisive and reactionary time. So that's a very, very short version of what we're doing. Eric, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I would just say that from the beginning, For Freedoms has been about hacking systems. And I think we started as a super PAC, tongue-in-cheek, because we wanted to hack the idea that there's a equivalence between money and speech or wealth and free expression in art or in politics. We have been, we've worked in advertising, which is something that we also have been a system that we've been trying to hack. Working with institutions and museums, another system. The art infrastructure is a system that we both recognize and work with, but also want to hack as artists and as creative people. Ideas about partisanship. I mean, we've always been anti-partisan, but so much of political speech happens in binaries, and so that's another system of political speech that we wanted to hack. And I think this year, in what we're calling the 2020 Awakening, we are really looking at the cultural rituals that underlie the political culture and that causes us to act as human beings, as citizens and non-citizens, as artists and people. And so those rituals, whether it's holidays or anniversaries or histories, these are things that we're really trying to encourage people to engage in this year, always through conversation, always through voice, using their own voice and expression and creative expression, and also in community. I mean, the Congress, the For Freedoms Congress that Michelle largely led and put together this year, right before COVID was something that left an impression on all of us that has sustained us through this time of sort of insecurity and not knowing what the new world was going to look like. And now here we are on the other, not on the other end of it, really in the midst of it with the other pandemic of structural racism, that we're contending with always and more visibly right now. And I think we are on the other side of that with, ready with the community, with the tools, with the excitement that we have generated as a creative community over the last 4 years, and that we're really going to ride through the rest of this year.
Thank you, Eric. Hank, you want to weigh in there on the campaign?
Yes, right after you, Claudia. We don't have time, I know.
We got 3 minutes left, Hank.
If we run out of time, we'll see them tomorrow at 4 p.m.
What's happening tomorrow at 4 p.m.?
I don't know. Hit me up at Hank Willis Thomas and we will find out.
Ooh, so alluring. You want to know what's happening tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you want to be down, if you feel like you want to hear more. Again, what's your handle? I don't know these things.
At Hank Willis Thomas on Instagram. You'll get on social media one day.
Probably not. All right. So the last thing that I want to mention is there's this quote by Paul Robeson. Artists are the gatekeepers of truth. We are the civilization's radical voice. And with that, the listening, justice, healing, and awakening, they seem like such basic sort of tenets of humanity. But the way that y'all have spoken about them today seems like a radicalization of these really simple concepts. Any last words that you want to put out there?
I'll take a few. So being radical is not necessarily a threat. Maybe it's a creative disruption. So as my role as disruptor at large, it's a creative gesture so that can help wake us up and myself out of our systematically, colonially enforced ways of looking at one another. I forgot the last thing I was going to say. Tomorrow at 4 p.m., don't come with any. The plan is you. You're the plan. Let us know what you already know, because deep inside of you, you know what has to happen. Don't be afraid. We're here with you. Thank you so much for leading us.
Any last words, Michelle or Eric? And then Eric, if you want to mention the next panel, the Summer of No.
Yeah, Michelle, did you want to say anything? I was just, well, thank you to the Guggenheim for inviting us to be collaborators here. And the next one is going to be, I believe, on August 27th. I'm sure the details are on the website. The title of it is going to be Reckoning. And it will be, it's being assembled by Jody Archambault, who's an artist and one of the, she was in the White House. She was the point person on Native issues in the Obama White House. And Suzanne Harjo, who is a curator and has done amazing things in terms of passing laws through cultural interventions, protecting Native lands and Indigenous rights. So that there are artists that are going to be, the panel is still being assembled. I know Edgar Heap of Birds is one of the people that we're talking about including there, and but there'll be more information, confirmable information on the website.
So as we move towards this journey of transforming the world around us so that it is more just, please join us for a day of reckoning at the next event with the Guggenheim. Thank you so much, y'all, for being with us. We really enjoyed our time, and thank you for the questions you posed. Really appreciate y'all.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.